Hey guys, thought I'd just do a second video here. This time I'm looking at the M4 Sherman. The Americans have a confusing way of naming things, but most M4s are generally called the Sherman. There's a bunch of different variations as the war went on where they learned from their mistakes. And I'm just going to show you how it's what you should be shooting at when you're shooting at a Sherman, and that will hopefully then remind you what not to do when you are in a Sherman. First thing is Shermans tended to brew up a little bit easily, mainly because the Americans were using petrol, I think, in the early versions rather than diesel. The British were smart; they converted all their Shermans to diesel, which is why the British ones don't brew up quite so easily. When you we'll look at the variations here. So we're looking at, first of all, the M4A1, which is one of the early versions of tanks of Shermans. It's got a cast hull, and you can tell it's got that it's a cast hull one because it's quite rounded. So it's a full cast hull and a full cast turret. Then you've got the M4, which was one of the next versions. It's not the next version between the two. There was, I think there was one between the M4A1 and the M4. And you can see here it's a much more welded construction on the hull because they realised that the cast had some weaknesses. The turret is still full cast, though, I think, in most of the Shermans. And then you look at the much later model, which is the M4A2, and we're going to look at all of them. Now, one thing with the Americans, they are sometimes beautifully stupid. So if we look at if you're facing off against a Sherman, with the cast turret, what you'll find is there's not a great deal of slope. So probably the worst place to hit it here is the slopiest parts. You can see it's expanding out to nearly 70 mil from 50 mil. Ironically, one of the best places to hit a Sherman if you've got a face-off front to front is actually straight through the front, which is normally we don't aim at any other tank because it's not very sloped and it's got only 51 mils, and most guns can penetrate that. One of the places you don't want to shoot a Sherman from the front is sort of this really tough part around the turret, unless you're going for a Hail Mary shot on the gun. Like most tanks, they don't like getting hit from the side. In particular, the Sherman is pretty pathetic on the side. It's only got like 38 mils of armor. Side of the turret is a little bit better, so if you've got an option, always take the side of the hull. If you need to hit the side of a turret because you can only hit the turret, it's not a bad shot either. From the front as well, a bit like the T-34, if you've got to do a shot where you really want to hope for a penetration, if you can really aim for the machine gun's port, it's also a shot trap. You can occasionally get the visors here, but it's a bit harder. Wouldn't recommend it. The rear of the tank, same deal with everything else. You shoot in the back, you'll take out the engine. You'll notice though, when I've got armor on here, that there's this weird little weak spot in the cast turret, and I'm not sure what actually caused that in historically, but there was a weak spot there that they realized. And so if you've got to aim at the turret, aim to the left side in around where that imaginary hole is, and you're more likely to penetrate. Again, when a tank is on a slight angle, like with the T-34, you're going to get a lot better thickness. So don't try and shoot the tank from distance or even close if you're at this sort of angle, if you can help it. Even the side, you know, you're looking at 119 thickness if you're at that sort of angle. As you bring it around, it gets better. So the angle of angling a Sherman is not as effective as angling a T-34. So that's why you don't tend to do it as much, because if you angle even the slightest bit too far, you're now exposing your very weak side. So Shermans tend to always want to face front on wherever they can and hope that people are dumb enough to shoot at their turret. Now, where do we shoot exactly on the tank? Well, here's the thing, okay? You'll see here the arrangement of the crew is quite high in the tank, and the Americans are beautifully stowing all of their ammo nice and high, not like the Russians who store it down low. They've got it in a ring behind the crew, under the crew, next to the crew, and only a reserve lot underneath the bottom. So when you're shooting into them, it's very easy. That's part of the reason why they were brewing up, and that combined with the petrol, and you've got a nice fire in your hands. The beauty about the stupidity of the Americans is in trying to fix that, what they did was this. You'll notice that there's these beautiful plates on some of their later versions. So you've got plates here, a plate randomly there, and a plate here. But if you recall, on the other one, that's where the weak part on the turret is. So for the later versions, you just aim at that. Here, why have they put them on the side? Oh look, that's where they store the ammo, and they realized a bit after designing the tank that if you get hit there, you blow up really quickly. Now these applique armors are next to useless, so don't feel that you shouldn't aim at them. You'll go through almost as easily as that they weren't there. I mean, you're adding 26 mil to 38 mil. You're still not high enough to stop any decent caliber weapons. They also put, if you zoom in, they also put some plates here and here on the welded model. Why? Because the model prior to this one, which is not in War Thunder, had a weak spot where these flat vision ports were that they introduced now that they didn't have the cast hull, because they stick out a lot more, and so they welded over the top of them. And of course, that's a dead giveaway that if you need to shoot from the front, you drop one in there. Now, it's not quite as effective on the front because it is a bit sloped, but when you look at the M4A2, which is a later model, it's actually a tier 3 battle rating, I think. You'll see they've changed the design to pull the slope a bit less, but they pulled it forward so that they don't create those weak points anymore. And this little bulldozer blade you've got here is much harder to get through than the other versions, and if you're shooting front on for that, almost guaranteed, unless you get a lucky shot into the machine gun, you won't penetrate, you'll bounce. You've really got to tackle these guys from the side, or you see they haven't covered the weak spot on this particular version. Anyway, hopefully that helps you shoot Shermans and not die as much in Shermans.